We are recording today's session, so be forewarned. Our session is entitled Meet the Editors, a Guide to Submitting and Publishing Your Academic Book. And I want to just go over briefly how we'll do things. I'm going to give brief introductions, just basically names and where folks are coming from of our panelists. And then I'm going to have each of them give a brief overview of what it is they do, where they do it. And then we'll launch into a round of questions that we'll take in kind of a round robin format. So anyone who wants to begin is welcome to do so. And then we'll just hear from everybody as we kind of roll through those. And for those of you who are joining us as attendees, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. I'll read those and we will give some time to make sure that we take up any questions that we have time to get to from our attendees. So I want to just thank again, all three of our editors for joining us. One who I know very well, two others who I'm meeting for the first time. So in alphabetical order, Niels Hooper is executive editor at the University of California Press. Margo Irvin is acquisitions editor at Stanford University Press, and coming to us from a soon-to-be snowbound Cambridge, Kathleen McDermott is executive editor for history at Harvard University Press. So why don't we go in reverse order? Kathleen, if you'd be willing to introduce yourself first, talk a little bit about what you do at the press, and then we'll go through and we'll jump into Q's and A's.
Sure. Kathleen McDermott, I am the executive editor for history at Harvard University Press. I've been at the press now a little over 22 years, so have seen a fair number of changes in the press. Harvard publishes in many disciplines and fields. We have certain strengths. The history list is a big list at Harvard and always has been. But we also publish a lot in science and in philosophy and some literature and philosophy. And I'd say those are probably the biggest points of focus at the press. But it is a press that has always focused heavily on that standalone book. We don't do, as many university presses do, we don't do a lot of publications in series at Harvard. So we look at books individually, and even if we don't have a big list in that particular field or subject, if we feel the book will appeal to people, it has something original and interesting to say, that's a book for Harvard.
Thank you. Fantastic. Margo, would you be willing to go second?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having us. I'm really happy to be here. So I am an acquisitions editor at Stanford University Press. I actually just passed my 7-year anniversary at Stanford. Time has really flown. Unfortunate that 3 years of that have been during pandemic times. And so my remit kind of broadly includes history, generally speaking. We also have area studies editors. Our Middle East studies editor acquires Middle East history. Our Asian studies editor acquires Asian history. So I'm primarily acquiring in history of the Americas, European history, and world history. Of course, all of those categories are very overlapping. I also run our Jewish studies list and our Asian American studies list. Both of those areas are pretty interdisciplinary, where I'm working not just with historians, but with literary scholars, with sociologists, and people kind of, working between fields. So Stanford publishes broadly in the humanities and social sciences, as well as in law and business. And, I think we've had ongoing discussions around kind of, what makes a Stanford book a Stanford book. And, I think one of those things is publishing books that are changing the conversation in some way. One of the things that has actually been a recent change to our program is somewhat kind of in concert with the launch of the Dorr School of Sustainability at Stanford. We've actually added a new editor to our roster who's acquiring in sustainability and global studies kind of broadly construed. And, that's going to be an interesting challenge, I think, because both of those kind of broad topics, I think, touch on so much of what all of us do in terms of thinking about the environmental humanities and thinking about kind of, the politics of climate change. So I'm very interested in speaking with scholars at all points in their careers, really, working on, I think global Cold War history is an area that I have a footprint in. I'm interested in doing more in kind of the history of science and technology. We have a really deep backlist in Latin American history. And so, I'm interested in talking to Latin Americanists who are working on projects that are transnational in nature, that are kind of touching on some of these other kind of thematic areas as well. I also run our Central and Eastern Europe series. And we have a couple of partnerships with, for instance, the Woodrow Wilson Center, where we run a Cold War International History series, and a newer series for us that's run in concert with the Hoover Institution Archive and Libraries on the history of authoritarian regimes. So we also have a new series that we're just kind of getting off the ground in British studies, which is really meant to take kind of an international lens. That series is just kind of getting off the ground as we speak. So obviously, I kind of have my, a lot of different kind of pots on the burner. And let's see, what else should I add? I will say, kind of to respond to something that Kathleen said, I would say maybe 50% of the books that I do are in a dedicated series that has a series editor who is kind of weighing in on the identity of that series and helping with recruitment and evaluation. And then the other half are kind of standalone books. And we can certainly talk more later about kind of the pros and cons of, whether it makes sense for a book to be in a series and sort of what that means about the framing. But yeah.
Hi, I'm Niels Hooper. I'm an executive editor of history and some area cultural studies at UC Press. I've been in publishing, this ages me, but for about 20 years now, which is horrifying. But I started off at Versa Books in New York, so a small trade, radical left-wing publisher, and then have been at UC Press for a long time now. Margo, I identify my remit in history very broadly to include a lot of things that I'm really interested in. I am the modern history editor at the Press. We have an ancient and sort of late antiquity studies editor that's very separate. I do U.S. history and American studies. I do Middle East studies and history. And I think I'm one of the only editors that does both of those, because I only see myself at both of those conferences and not and different editors from every other press. And I love that. I love the way that those fields sort of inform each other in the ways that I am sort of interested in the projects that I do. I also have a small British studies series. I do kind of sport and world history. I have a world history series as well. UC Press is a big humanities and social sciences press. We have a small sort of science and technology list, but mostly we do humanities and social sciences. We are really known for history, but also very much for sociology and anthropology, and we've been in those fields for a very long time. We have recently started new lists in economics and technology. We've long sort of done environmental studies, so we've made that into an editor position, even though it was across several lists before. We do art history and a few other disciplines as well, but there are large areas that we don't do too. I think what makes a UC Press book is that we're a few things. One is we're not afraid of interdisciplinarity. A lot of there's pros and cons of being a sort of serious history book or being a history book that speaks to other disciplines or is informed by other disciplines too. And so amongst all of the editors at the Press, whether they're the sociology editor or the history editor or the anthro editor or the environmental studies editor. We're all interested in sort of broad interdisciplinary fields like race and ethnic studies, like environmental studies, like gender and sexuality. And so we see those as our lists too. We're also the only large university press associated with a public university. And so we've sort of interpreted that as part of a kind of more public and avowedly kind of progressive and social justice mission than I think a lot of other presses. So we aim to publish, you know, the best new scholarship, like everyone here, but also books that inform progressive social change, or can lead to change too. I do again, sort of, Kathleen brought up this point. So I do handle the American Crossroads series, which is a long-standing series that I think has helped. And it started before I was at UC Press. But I think it's helped establish ethnic studies as, you know, a serious discipline in the US over the last sort of 20, 30 years that it's been around. So it's a very strong series for us. But then in some other areas that I do, like Middle East studies, I don't have any series at all. And those books all just stand alone and speak to sort of common interests that we have. So I agree that there are pros and cons to being in a series or being a standalone book. And yes, thanks very much.
No, thanks to all three of you. It's extremely generative. And I think the series question is one I'd like to come back to later in the conversation. I have a couple of, I guess, more. Oh, welcome, Amelia. Hello. A couple of, I guess, slightly more intellectually expansive questions, but I wanted to start with a kind of a practical one, which is that I was introduced both to Niels and to other university press editors through other faculty members. And so it was very much a kind of personalized introduction. And I know that levels of mentoring are quite uneven across the UC system. We have people joining us from every campus. So I wanted to kind of get your sense on what the best way is for faculty members or advanced graduate students, people who are publishing, to reach out to you, to get a hold of you, if the expectation is still generally that you'll meet people personally at conferences, just sort of how people might think about the most effective way to flash across your radars or to get in touch with you about their projects. Anyone is welcome to start. Yeah.
Well, let me go then.
Go ahead.
It's a yeah, it happens in a lot of different ways. I always encourage people to first think about, rather than blanketing the university press landscape, is to think about what presses publish in the field you work in. You know, look at the books on your shelves. What books are informing your own work, and take a look at the publishers, and that'll give you a starting point for who to contact. And I get contacts through my own authors who will recommend people, through conferences where I meet people, and just over the transom. Those are harder if you don't really target an editor. It's best if you take a look at the press's website and look at the editors. I think most of us now have websites that showcase the editors and what they work on. And you can get a better sense of writing directly to an editor and just explain your project and see if it generates interest on the part of the editor. Publishing still is really a highly networked business. And if you can find a way to connect through a known author or through a faculty member to an editor at the press, that does help.
I just piggyback off that and just say that the publishing landscape also changes very dramatically and often. And so building off Kathleen's point, that you need to look at which books have been published recently from a press that you're interested in. We, for instance, we did a lot of very important European history, French and German history 20, 30 years ago, and we're not doing that anymore. Harvard is, and Princeton and a bunch of other presses are much better at that now. So things like that change. We used to have a philosophy list, and we don't have a philosophy list anymore. So not focusing on the books that came out 20, 30 years ago, but the books that have come out in the last 5 years from a press, and would be the way to go.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think I imagine I speak for all of us when I say, I have a lot of volume in my email inbox. And, so the sort of personalized touches in terms of, it's 100% fine to kind of send to cold email an editor, but I want to see that you have taken the time to kind of think about, is my project really potentially a fit with this list, given what's been recently published, given what's available about the editor's acquisitions interests. And likewise, I would say, having kind of the personal introduction of someone who I've worked with before, able to kind of say like, oh, just, giving you a heads up that so-and-so may be reaching out to you with their proposal, I know their work, I can kind of vouch for them. That does mean something, but it's absolutely not a prerequisite. And, there's not an expectation that you need kind of a formal introduction. I will also say, as Niels was saying, like lists evolve. And so for instance, I mentioned this new British studies series that we're doing. We have some of that in our deeper backlist, but this is also kind of a growth area for us. So someone looking at our list might not see that as, oh, I can look at these kind of, comparative titles that you recently published. So, I am also doing my own research and outreach. I'm looking at conference programs to see if the paper title that you're presenting is something that piques my interest. And I may reach out to you and say, we're both going to be at this conference. Are you up for a meeting? So I would definitely also encourage folks to make sure that, when I Google you, I am going to be able to find relevant information. So, that your faculty page is up to date, that it says maybe the topic of the book that you're working on and what your previous publications are. So I think, making yourself visible to editors is also, behooves authors in terms of kind of setting yourself up for success.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I would just say, in a very practical sense, I do think conferences are really important still. We're kind of emerging from the, COVID era of not going to them. And we were trying to sort of replicate those meetings virtually. But either way, the conference, whether you're attending or not, or you want to sort of set up a virtual meeting, it forms kind of a nexus around which the editor is thinking about that field and meeting a lot of prospective new people. And for me, and I think maybe this is true of everybody, but just sending a cold call email before a conference with a very short outline, like 2 or 3 sentences of what your project's about and what you want to talk about, and then is a really good way of setting up a meeting, not cold calling at the conference, and not sending a massive sort of book proposal beforehand, but just soliciting interest in anticipation of a meeting based on a sort of brief pitch. Is a really good way.
Except if it is a brief pitch, I would also encourage people to really highlight the point about how this work is different or new if you work in a big literature. If I get just a query, an email query about, I'm writing a book about Nazi Germany, and that's it. That's an easy, I'm not interested. So you need, especially if you work in a big literature, you want to be sure that you are highlighting originality. What's new? What are you doing that's different from what's already out there?
That's extremely, extremely helpful. Amelia, do you want to jump in with a question for our panelists?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in because I've been, this was certainly something I was especially thinking about with my first book when I was still pre-tenure and when I was really anxious, right? The book means everything and the timing of the book means everything. And everything you've said has answered a lot of my questions around this as well. What is the current state of the field or philosophy in the field about multiple submissions, especially for first-time authors who are trying to sort out, how to actually make the timeline work? And maybe together with that, you could think about, if multiple submissions is not acceptable, or if it's acceptable only in certain cases, what would an ideal timeline look like for an author planning to, say, come up for tenure in 4 years or something?
I mean, I will say, unless someone is explicitly saying so, I am not going to assume that a proposal has been submitted exclusively to me. That said, if in that kind of approach email someone says, Stanford is my first choice and I am submitting exclusively to you, that carries weight in the sense that, it signals to me this author has thought about this press being the right fit for reaching the readership they want to reach. And that's significant in terms of my consideration of the project. Oftentimes when I get that kind of initial outreach, whether that's kind of in concert with a conference like Niels was talking about, obviously, that's not always going to be possible, but I like to, if it's something that seems potentially a fit for my list, to try to have just a brief kind of preliminary conversation where I can explain what Stanford's process looks like and answer questions and kind of get a sense of the author's priorities, how they're hoping that the book is going to appear in the world. Are we on the same page about that? And I would definitely encourage authors to think about reaching out to various presses and kind of be able to ask questions of multiple editors to kind of get a sense of what the process looks at various different presses, and to feel like their work would be supported there, that the editor is able to kind of speak their language, that they will be a good advocate for it to that press's marketing team and that type of thing. When we get to the point of sending materials out for review, that's a commitment of resources on the part of the press. And so I will say to folks at that point, our expectation is that you will grant us the right of exclusive review. Sometimes there are cases where, because of timing issues, we may be open to discussing a simultaneous review, but in that case, it's really essential to just be fully transparent, to know that an editor at another press has also said yes to this, not to sign a contract with any press before everyone involved has the opportunity to make an offer. I think really, transparency is the name of the game. And, the author-editor relationship really is one that's based on trust. So I would say, as long as you're putting your cards on the table, an editor will be able to answer questions about expectations around that. That's my thinking on the subject.
Yeah, I think that's no, Margo's dead right about transparency. Harvard we work a little bit differently from a lot of our colleagues at other presses, and it's been a relatively recent change. About 5 years, we got a new director press, and whereas, and especially, let's just talk about first books for a moment. Talking about first books, so dissertation books, essentially. We used to have the manuscripts read before discussing them in-house in terms of acquisition. Harvard now, we do everything on proposals, everything, including first books. So if I'm interested in a first book, I need a full substantive proposal, and that will be what gets circulated to my colleagues. So we're no longer in the position of having to wait for other presses to review manuscripts. That has its good side and bad side. But it is also true that, and I think most of us, not all of us who work in university presses now, we know how time sensitive first projects are. And I don't know anyone. You think if that's right? Yes, I don't know anyone who now will hold authors to exclusivity right from the get-go. We all, of course, want to know that you are submitting this to other presses. Margo's right about that. That is really important for an editor to know. And then really it's just a question of the author figuring out, well, look, if I have 3 really great presses that I think my book fits with, you know, focus on those presses rather than trying to send it around to 7 different presses, because you're setting yourself up as an author for, if you have a top 3, my top 3 presses, I know them, and you hear back first from press number 7, you have a decision to make. So it really helps an author to think through who really you want to publish this book with, and then talk to the editor. Tell them your concerns, tell them timing concerns. If your tenure clock is close, you absolutely must know and relay that to your editor, because timing is crucial. And the length now between, I would say, you know, submission and when a book is published, that's gotten longer for a number of reasons everywhere.
And we can help a lot with the timing. I mean, we can, you know, as long as you haven't left it till the absolute last minute. But I mean, I often write, and I'm sure everybody here often writes letters. You know, if a manuscript has been through review, if the editor has revised, if it's been approved by a faculty board, but is not, you know, yet printed and published, you know, I've often written letters to tenure boards to say that, you know, we are committed, the book is coming out by this certain date, you know, it's on target, and those have been accepted. So there are lots of things we can do to make sure you meet your tenure clock. So being clear about timing. And just to echo the other points that I was making, I think the further along in the process it is, the more exclusive, you know, I would want it to be. So at the beginning, I do expect that you're asking a few editors, you're feeling out who gets the book, who is excited by your project. Certainly once you send it out for review, I mean, I will entertain a multiple submission for books that I'm very eager about. Usually less so for first books, but certainly for second or third books. But you know, I do expect at that point it would be no more than sort of 2 presses that are actually sending it out for review. And then if I feel like we've had a lot of conversations, we've exchanged a lot of ideas about the book, I'm excited, we have a good rapport, and then suddenly you decide to go, and I've sent it out for review, and then suddenly you decide to go for, you know, with another press, then I feel burnt, you know, at that point. So I think, you know, at that point, you do kind of expect it to be exclusive and to be very transparent about what you're doing. But early on, I think reaching out to a few presses, especially with the tenure clock in mind, is a good thing.
I want to get to some of the questions Gustavo has put out, but I guess this is kind of follows from that, which is, does it make a difference? I know, Kathleen, you've mentioned the proposal. Once a faculty member is into the kind of next stage of the submission process, do you prefer chapters so that they're more maybe manageable for the external reviewers? Do you prefer that someone gets you an entire draft of the book? Does one or the other of those, in your experience, make for a book that comes to press more readily or quickly, or is it really contingent upon the author?
Well, because we do make acquisition decisions based on proposals now, rather than having manuscripts read. I do need to see a full proposal, and there are certain elements in there beyond the description of the book that we can talk about. And it always helps to have a sample chapter or 2 just to see what the writing is like, because that helps us position the book along a publication spectrum for us that runs from our trade books, our general interest books, to the academic monographs, and this category in between called academic trade that tends to skew a little bit academic, has to do some professional lifting for the author, but is well written on an interesting topic that may also garner some general interest. So the proposal itself plus a writing sample, and the writing sample should reflect what the book is. So if it's a dissertation book and an author is sending me a chapter from the dissertation, that's not helpful.
Yeah, I think that's part of why it's important to try to have conversations with editors kind of at a fairly early stage to get a sense of what their process is in terms of the review and approval process. At some point, a full manuscript will need to be peer reviewed and accepted for publication by the press's editorial board. And, there are a few different pathways in terms of, an advance contract that is offered on the basis of a proposal and potentially sample material. For me, in the majority of cases with first books, I will be able to indicate to an author based on a proposal and sample chapters if it's something I'm interested in sending out for peer review. And yeah, as Kathleen was saying, the sample chapter is really crucial. And mostly, I am not going to be a content expert on every book that comes across my desk. I'm leaving it to the peer reviewers to, point out potential gaps in the argument and sourcing and that type of thing. I'm really looking for, what is the writing style and approach? Is this something that an upper level undergraduate would be able to, grasp? Is this something that a general reader outside of academia, is going to be able to get into? Because that's so significant for exactly the kind of like positioning and budget discussions that we're having internally at that stage. So I would say, at the point when you're kind of initially approaching editors, it's useful to get feedback from them on what they need in order to, make that next decision point happen. And to think about making sure that like when you want to get a commitment from a publisher that you have available a sample chapter that is representative of the writing style and approach that you're going for in the book as a whole. But also, I think it can be useful to have a conversation with an editor too, to kind of think through, the readership, the audience, what kind of choices you can make as a writer to achieve that. And that's also what we're here for, is to kind of be a sounding board for those conversations.
Yeah, I would just say that to sort of, we used to, for first books, we used to peer review whole manuscripts always. And now, and actually over a long time, we've kind of bent those rules. And depending on different situations, certainly if somebody's won a bunch of prizes for their dissertation and, I want to jump on it first, I might, peer review a proposal and look at a proposal and a sample. So we bend those rules in multiple ways. I do think it's very helpful for you to get feedback and to get a sense of the press's sort of commitment to the project and the editors and the marketing department sort of shared vision for it from peer review of as much of the material as you can get, because that sort of prevents surprises happening later. But I really wanted to sort of jump in and echo the point, because I do think that the common mistake that a lot of first-time authors do in reaching and coming to an editor and to a press is thinking that we're kind of an extension of your dissertation or tenure committee looking for like the academic minutiae. Some of us, were in PhD programs. Some of us have PhDs who come out of the academic world. Some of us don't. But we're really interested, I think all of us, in translational scholarship, how clearly you can make your arguments to as wide a possible audience, wide as an audience as possible. And so that's what we're looking for in the proposal, and a lot of people will send me sort of 5 pages of theory and then get to the kind of argument that they're making on page 6. And that's a quick reject because that's not how books work. If my boss at Verso used to say, if you can't express a book in a sentence, then it's not a book. I think that's a bit harsh, but that is the sort of famous elevator pitch. And that is how books succeed. Partly it's reviews, partly it's prizes, but mostly it's people at cocktail parties saying, oh, did you read this book on this that did this, in 2 sentences? And if you can put that at the top of your proposal, that this is what your book does, and get the interest of a reader immediately, and then expand on how it does all of that, then it's more of a winner. So we're looking at that, how well and clearly you can express yourself and excite our interest, because not just because we want to be interested, but because that's how we can get the widest attention for the book in the end.
I think, Danny, we should turn to some of these great questions that Gustavo has posted in the questions, and we have a whole list of questions that we're prepared to ask as well. But these are really good, and please, to our audience, please go ahead and use the Q&A section to pose more questions. But Gustavo has a question about. I want to jump right into this question about underrepresented minority authors and how to encourage authors from Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, LGBT communities. Are there specific programs to try and diversify what gets published? And is there a kind of mentorship program that might be set up? And then another question that he asks, and there are 4 questions here, or 4 questions here that you guys can also read and respond to. But another really important question is, do you recommend books or resources that might be available to help, just to recommend to people to explain the publication process? So either of those questions, or if you want to dig into some of the questions in the chat, please go ahead.
I think that we're painfully aware of how white the publishing industry is, and you can see on this panel, but and it is at all the big publishing houses in New York, and not just the university presses, and we're I think a lot of presses are sort of backtracking strongly to try and change that. And that's just the sort of pool of kind of gatekeepers, of the editors, of the people that actually work at the publishing houses. I think that landscape is slowly and belatedly changing, which is a good thing. Obviously, but also there are programs. We have a first gen program which we launched about 3 or 4 years ago, and we provide, if you identify yourself as a first gen scholar, we provide various resources. There's a special program for that, and we provide some money to take time off for whatever, like babysitting or for editorial help, or whatever you want to use it for. And we provide various kind of workshops that are on our website, and we provide a lot of kind of resources and tools for first-gen scholars to navigate the publishing process. And we're going around quite heavily to conferences and sort of doing panels on this too. We have also started again in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, again belatedly, kind of monitoring both the peer reviewers that we use and the author pool we have, just so we're more aware of, when we're skewing too heavily male, too heavily white, too heavily, in all of those areas. But peer review is an important part of that process too. And it's a difficult one to navigate, because you don't want to lean all of these arduous responsibilities on the few faculty of color that are that have a million of other responsibilities to do. So you don't want to make work harder for minority communities, but we also want people, a wide and diverse peer review pool that can appreciate different voices and different arguments, different forms of scholarship.
I think the first gen program that UC Press has is fantastic. And of course, there are conversations taking place in the publishing industry, across the academy, about how to kind of try to change some of these entrenched inequalities in the system. And one of the things that we are looking at is, the peer review process, but all of the other sort of things that kind of inform the way that, a book's profile gets raised. So thinking about, who are we going to as blurbers, and that type of thing as well. And so, the last thing we want is for the publishing process to seem like a black box. And so, I think I can speak for most acquisitions editors when I say, we want to answer questions and demystify things. And that's why we're eager to do panels like this. I would definitely encourage folks to reach out to us also to, speak to smaller groups and, whether that is graduate students, postdocs, early career folks. And yeah, I think that's a great question.
Harvard is in the same boat, and I think all the presses now, we're very much aware, have been for many years now, of the need to really reach out to the wide range of authors, scholars, peer reviewers, blurbers, and it filters all the way down to things as seemingly minor as when we put up big jacket shots at conferences of our new books. There is an in-house discussion now for every single conference, and we divide that presentation equally between men and women. And we be sure that there are authors of color represented there. So it's an ongoing conversation and an ongoing need. We're not there yet.
Yeah, some of the questions, this is super helpful. And some of the questions here, I want to make sure we at least touch on. There's a question about the exact steps from sort of email to publication. And I want to fold that, I guess, into two questions to ask. Is there a place on your press's website or otherwise that that lays out for prospective authors the sort of entirety of the process? Or is that something that people are still kind of learning individually in the course of their conversations with you? And then I also wanted to get to this question about folks who maybe are not on the tenure track, but are still in the academic career world, and or whether or not your press publishes any books by non-academics. So I guess it's a little bit of a catch-all, but any of those that you want to take up, I'd be grateful for answers to.
I would just say I'm looking for the most interesting books. So I absolutely publish non-academics. Obviously all of our books have to meet a certain academic bar, so it's sometimes a little harder for journalists or activists to sort of do that. But we think of that quite broadly. I mean, I publish, Rebecca Solnit, who's a Bay Area writer who's not an academic. I publish. And those are some of my best books. So I'm very excited about publishing non-academic and activists, certainly people that are part of social movements that use their books as part of sort of speaking to those communities. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, I was actually just having a conversation with my colleagues the other day about the need to provide more information on our website about kind of what the review and publication process looks like, because frequently that is part of the conversation I'm having with authors. I think it looks fairly similar at most presses. But off the top of my head, I can think of, I think it's UNC Press has a great kind of like flow chart kind of showing some of the typical steps. I mean, peer review is very important, and then different presses will have different kind of internal committees and editorial boards that will need to approve a project on the basis of peer reviews, their internal conversations around budget, positioning, that type of thing. And then, an editor can also kind of fill you in about what the production process will look like in terms of, copy editing, typesetting, proofs, and the typical length of how long it will take from submitting a final manuscript to having the book actually, between boards, we say. And then, of course, the kind of marketing activities that take place. Going back to a question that came up earlier, Bill Germano's From Dissertation to Book is kind of a classic in the field for navigating the transition of turning a dissertation into a book that people beyond your kind of immediate field are going to want to read. I think there are some aspects of that book where, you know, the Academy has changed in some ways and are maybe not quite as relevant as when the book originally came out, but, you know, there have been new editions. And I think the underlying kind of logic of, you know, writing for an audience that is going to want to pay to read your argument, and, you know, how you can kind of provide the scaffolding for people who don't have the specialized background, are still really relevant. And yeah, I also just wanted to quickly speak to, I think I saw another question about working with literary agents. And I think this actually ties in somewhat to the question of, you know, working with authors who are not necessarily in a tenure track position. You know, I think there is sort of a tension in our jobs and in the university press world generally around the balance between kind of providing a service to the Academy in terms of kind of credentialing junior faculty, you know, putting out books that would not be economically viable from a commercially based publisher, and also like the mission that we are serving, which is really to make sure that the work of academics is disseminated as broadly as possible. And so, you know, I think working with junior faculty who their goal is to produce a book that is going to guarantee them tenure, you know, might mean that it's a slightly different kind of looking book than someone who, you know, is pursuing a different path, whether they have an academic background or not. And I think the core focus is really, you know, making sure that the book is reaching the academic standard that we expect it to, but that it's also, and I think I loved the turn of phrase that Niels used earlier about translational scholarship, about kind of, you know, being able to articulate specialized research to an audience that doesn't necessarily have that background. And so, yeah, I mean, I have signed books from journalists and from kind of community historians. I would say working with an agent is necessary if you have ambitions of pitching your book to a major trade publisher. And, you know, if you are interested in working with a university press, it is not necessary depending on the kind of book that you are writing. But I think it has a lot to do with sort of your ambitions for what it is that you hope the book does for you. And we're very invested in, you know, working with authors on developing their platforms so that, you know, even beyond the life of the book is kind of one aspect of them being able to communicate their ideas more broadly, whether that is appearing on podcasts, whether that is, you know, writing op-eds. Obviously, like the book is the main thing for us as book publishers, but that's something where, you know, we want to provide support and coaching to authors to build that out in a way that's going to be kind of mutually beneficial. I hope I didn't take too many different questions and try to, you know, shove them all into one answer, but.
No, that's excellent. Kathleen, I don't know if maybe you want to also jump in on some of those.
No, I just wanted to say that in terms of the publishing process, I think that largely remains a conversation between an author and editor, because different authors will be interested in different aspects of that over others. And different publishers have different timelines, their own internal timelines that we'll go over with authors. So I think that largely, rather than trying to lay it all out formally on a website, it's still mostly a conversation between an author and editor. And in terms of non-tenure track authors, we also publish journalists and public historians, but as Niels said, you always have to keep in mind that at some point down the line in this process, there's going to be a faculty board who is reviewing this project, and they're looking for academic standards. They're looking to see that university press imprint going on that book meets a certain standard. So that means that the author really has to be up to date in her scholarship, has to be up to date in what's going on in the field, because those are the kinds of things the board will look for. It's a slightly different, can be a slightly different scenario with journalists. And I have to say that on the history list at Harvard, we don't do a lot of straight up journalists. The science list does, because academic scientists don't write books. So and the board knows that, and they look at them in a slightly different way.
Amelia,
we
go
have
ahead.
we have a little life of a book thing on our website too, so I just posted that as one of the responses.
Oh, excellent, thank you. Amelia, did you want to grab one of these to throw out to our folks?
Yeah, we're getting a lot more questions from the audience, so I think we should focus on those, although we could keep going. There's so many questions. This is like such a wonderful opportunity to get to talk to you guys about this. Someone asked, had a kind of follow-up question about series. And the question involves launching a new series, but I think it might be worth having you talk a little bit about how the series works in general at each of your presses. Would one approach you? Is it best if one approaches you with an idea of a series in mind? And, this question involves maybe even launching a new series for a first-time author. Usually I hear about sort of a second time around author being the one to launch a series, but maybe you can talk a little bit also about how those series get born.
It's not a Harvard question. We don't do them.
Yeah. So I don't know if Margo or Niels, if you want to talk a little bit about how these there are series editors, I know at some presses that will have their own niche market. And, what are the pros and cons? And I don't know, Kathleen, you may also have thoughts about this. What are the pros and cons of publishing with a series versus not with a series?
I think how it gets born, the way we would launch a new series, it would be to identify an area of a sort of cutting edge area that's changing a field, and we want to sort of make a statement that this, we can do something new through this series that will help push the field in a completely new direction, or and a single book, it would be hard for necessarily a single book to do that, but a series sort of with very well curated couple or more of series editors could do that. We have, we have recently launched a series of critical refugee studies with a critical refugee collective with Leia Spiritu Gandhi. I just recently launched a series called of small books called American Studies Now: Critical Histories of the Present, with Lisa Dugan and Curtis Barres, who's at UCSD. But they're very senior scholars, and the idea for that series was to do very short, quick books that came out while current affairs were unfolding, before the time for long monographs could be done, that could intervene, could build on sort of what's happening in the news, but give a kind of more critical and in-depth perspective on it. And that series is doing really well. And Barbara Ransby has a book, Making All Black Lives Matter, in that series. And there's some other really high-profile books. So I'm excited about that. But we don't often launch new series. We wouldn't usually do it with junior scholars. We wanted to do it with, usually senior scholars who want to make an impact on the field and bring in their own expertise and networks to sort of push it in a new direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when I am working with series editors, my hope is that they're going to be able to kind of enable me to do more than I would be able to do on my own. And so I'm relying on them to kind of really have their finger on the pulse of the field, and, kind of work their networks with other senior scholars to kind of identify up and coming junior scholars who might not already be on my radar, to be able to act as advisors. And, if I do get a proposal that just comes in over the transom, to be able to go to them and say, what do you think of this? What are your impressions? I mean, every series is going to be different in terms of, sometimes there are series that actually do not have a dedicated series editor, and it is more kind of a classification that the press is using to kind of market books in a specific way. especially because once upon a time when libraries bought a lot of books, a library might have a standing order for every new book in a series. But yeah, I think, some series editors are going to be more hands-on and are going to actually provide feedback on individual manuscripts. Sometimes they're going to act in a more kind of advisory capacity. But I think certainly, if you have a relationship with someone who is a series editor and you are able to kind of have a conversation with them to get a sense of, what are the expectations for books in this series, they will be able to kind of provide some insight on that. I will say though that, frequently a series editor is really looking at projects from the perspective of, the academy and the scholarly contribution. And so there are times where, I will look at that project and I will have to say, yes, I think that the topic is an interesting one, but it's not something that's going to be viable for us because it's too long. It's not being developed in the way that's going to speak to a broad enough audience for it to really be feasible. So it's always going to be a conversation between the editor, the acquisitions editor from the press is going to have to, be heavily involved in. New series, I think we want to avoid the possibility of kind of starting a series that's too trendy, because we want there to be kind of longevity. We want to be building something. And I think sometimes authors have concerns that if their book appears in a series that it's maybe going to be pigeonholed. And so I think, that's something to bring up with your editor and make sure that, the press would have the resources to promote the book outside of that series specifically. For instance, I was just talking with someone who is writing a book about the history of Jewishness in Brazil. And so while it's a book that may appear in our Jewish Studies series, we would also be able to promote it to, Latin Americanists. And so I think it's important to just sort of get a sense of, what are the press's strengths in terms of making the book visible to the constituencies that matter to you, regardless of having kind of that series label on it or not.
I would just don't be afraid of not being in a series. Like I get a lot of authors that propose me and say, "Oh, I what series is my book good for?" And I say I'm really excited about the book. We can do a great job, and that speaks to Kathleen's point. But it's not for one of our series, and it'll do really well on its own. And so don't be afraid of that. But where I do in terms of the Pigeonhole thing, I think where a series can work, like the American Crossroads series that I sort of handle, is an ethnic studies series. But if somebody is in, say, environmental studies and would not reach an ethnic studies audience automatically, but would reach their environmental studies audience, or if they're in technology, or if they're in criminology or something else, but it's a book that's really good for our American Crossroads series, I think that can help kind of unpigeonhole their book. It can move them out of their field and get their book to speak to a very broad, well-known, well-connected ethnic studies field through that series. So that it can be an advantage for sure.
If I can just clarify, I think I may have, misrepresented the question a little bit when I first read it, and nonetheless, you've spoken to, I think, to the answer. But I think the question may have involved being invited to contribute a book to a new series and whether that's inadvisable if it's a first book. And then a kind of tangential question that somebody had asked was, should a first author seek an advance contract? So I think those are somewhat related questions because they're both kind of strategic questions around first books for things that might be dangled as low-hanging fruit that may or may not be advisable.
I don't know about the other, Kathleen and Margo. To me, an advance contract there's no such thing really as an advance contract. All contracts are the same, and they all have a clause in that say, if you don't hand in a manuscript that's acceptable to the press, we can move out of the contract. So that's exactly the same contract, whether we base it on a proposal or whether we base it on a full manuscript. It all has that clause in. People talk about advance contracts because in a sense, you're getting it maybe before you've written the full book, but the actual contract looks exactly this at UC Press anyway, looks exactly the same, whether it's based on a proposal or a full manuscript, or whether it's about to go into production, or whether it's 5 years away from production.
And in the University of California, it will help you not at all coming up for promotion to tenure if your book is not existing in a more existential format than that. Yeah. Can I
Yeah.
just jump in there? Because I know we're close to time and I want to respect that and end before we start to attrit folks. But I just wanted to kind of ask, maybe by way of a preliminary summary, because I hope we'll have the opportunity to have this conversation again. On the one hand, this week we saw yet another Death of the Humanities article appear. On the other hand, as you can see behind Amelia, her office is full of books. And so rather than talk about the future of publishing, I just wanted to hear each of your thoughts on the present of publishing, or kind of check in about where you see us as humanists and how you feel just about the acquisition and publishing and existence of the book in this particular historical moment that we find ourselves in.
You know, publishing, it's a terrible thing to say, but publishing had a wonderful time during the pandemic. And in a way, a lot of us saw that as hopeful, that people will still turn to books, a wide range of books. And although we're now all moving back toward the pre-pandemic normal in terms of sales, we still get good sales, a lot of attention for our books in the humanities. And we all think that there will continue to be an audience for those kinds of books, especially as we've all pointed to this. The bigger the audience you can speak to, the greater impact the book is going to have. There are, of course, books that do the kind of ground level work methodologically, theoretically, that needs to be done, that then informs the bigger, more general interest books. And we all publish books like that. And we know that they're not going to sell a lot of copies, but they're important for the scholarship. They move the field. And that's always that double consideration that university presses have. We have a mandate for scholarship. We need to have books that move the field. But at the same time, there are ways, even with first books and books on the monograph end, that you can help an author along to have a book that speaks to as many people as possible.
I would just, jump in and echo that. I think what's changed a lot, you'll hear that. I mean, I could go on for an hour on this, but I'll try and keep it really short. But library purchases have declined precipitously over the last 20 years. So university presses a while ago could publish a very scholarly book and guarantee 2,000 sales, and that's not true anymore at all. So very specialized monographs. We do have an open access program for those building block books that Kathleen was talking about, that may not see large sales, but should be available and are important scholarship. And in fact, the open access model for those books, we print them. They exist as print books, but they're free online to anybody in the world. So they get bigger impact, I think, through that program. So that sort of does away with a small, high-priced monograph that used to be sold to only very specialized libraries. But yes, and also the other thing is discoverability has changed a lot too. So book review venues have declined enormously. But there are new opportunities with the digital sphere. People can. So what's important to new authors is to speak to as wide an audience as possible, not just to a specialized audience that sort of would 20 years ago have those large library sales but wouldn't exist anymore. But also to build your own platform. And be active as much as you can in whatever ways you're comfortable, whether it's speaking, whether it's writing op-eds, whether it's being an activist, whether it's just building the communities for you. You're building your voice, seeing the book as an extension of your platform, because the book review venues are not necessarily out there. There are a ton of books competing for journal reviews. That, you know, so the more but there are lots of opportunities, digital opportunities for you to create a voice for yourself and for your book alongside it.
Yeah, I mean, I similarly, feel very bullish about book publishing. I think, publishing a book is a way of being a part of a broader conversation. And, I think one of the things that is so beautiful about a book is that, it is, once it has been published, it will continue to exist in that format. And, what I think is also so important about university press publishing in particular is that because of our peer review model and the fact that we are able to say, this has been vetted by experts. I think especially in today's world, it's so important to be able to have those sources to turn to. And I think, kind of building on what Niels was saying, publishing a book with a university press establishes an author's credibility to speak to some of these larger issues in a number of different venues. And so, yeah, I mean, I think none of us would be here if we didn't see the value and importance of this. And I would also just say, a lot of authors will come to me and sort of say, I have these ambitions of my book being read broadly outside of my field. And I would, encourage all of you too, to kind of turn the question around in some ways and ask yourself, how broadly am I reading, outside of my own field, and what can I learn from those books that are attempting to kind of, speak beyond disciplinary boundaries and to more general readerships, and to participate both as a reader and as an author, because, we are all in this together in terms of, this project of building and disseminating knowledge.
That's a lovely, lovely point to end on. And I would end on it and let everybody go, but there is one kind of practical question that I think I saw that I just want to hear quickly your thoughts on, which is, do you have a hard and fast expectation or limit about how much of a given book can appear in article form or otherwise? And just as people are thinking about their own publication trajectories and files and planning, what kind of information, suggestions, advice, warnings can you give early authors about what they should or shouldn't release in other formats that they plan to have in the book?
There are two considerations here. One is a technical consideration. We cannot register copyright twice for the same text. So for authors who have 6 chapters and they published 2 chapters that are reproduced verbatim in the book in journals, we have to exempt those chapters from copyright. And that has implications for subrights down the line. And the second question is more marketing consideration. If you publish the heart of your book, the one chapter that people are really going to look at as the essence of this book, in an article in a journal, who's going to buy the book? They'll go to the journal if they want to use the article. So you want to think in terms of it's drawing on the same ideas, talking about the book in the same way in articles is fine. And particularly in history, we know this is what historians do to attach their name to the topic. They write articles. So they've got their name out there attached to it. But you want to think about, is there a part of the book, a part of the project, a part of the dissertation that I could spin off into a journal article and not use in the book? That's the best way to approach it. But you want to think carefully about how much of the book you are verbatim reproducing in journal articles, because if I have a project that comes in and half of the book has been published in articles and it's verbatim, I'm not interested in doing the book. There's no point.
Margo or Niels?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to type in a response about our open access program. I absolutely echo that. I mean, for me, it's the marketing thing. Like you know, if you're teaching, you know what you assign your students. You will assign them a journal article if the essence of the book is there, and then you won't assign them the book. And you want to get read. You don't want to get just public. I mean, yes, you want to get tenure, you want to get promotion, you want all these publications, but you really want to get read, and you want your book to be successful, and you want it to be read. And if you're giving too much of it away in article form, nobody will buy or read the book. But you can definitely publish sort of discrete sections of it that don't give away the core argument of the book, and sometimes, you know, think of it maybe as a way of eliciting interest for the book. You know, it can be a sort of publicity way. You know, people, if people read just enough to be more interested in reading your whole book, you know, that's great, and that's something that I am interested in. I think a rule of thumb is no more than 2 articles from a book. I mean, it does start to get kind of ridiculous once it's more than that. Then you really feel, we as editors, I think, really feel like you're giving most of the book away.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think, you know, it's definitely a great thing to publish material that's going to establish yourself as the go-to person on a specific topic. And I would also say, you know, in the transition from dissertation to the book, you know, it's great when people feel liberated to say, you know, this entire chapter does not need to be part of the book. And so I think, you know, there's room to kind of play around with thinking of the book as a really wholly different text than the dissertation, and you know, giving yourself some room there in terms of what pieces are maybe better suited for a journal audience. You know, and I think it's important that the book be coherent as a whole. And so, you know, if you are saying, oh, well, this one chapter can be read in isolation, that's not really doing the work of a book. You know, every part of the book needs to be clear why it is there, why it is in the order it is, you know, what the full narrative arc is. And so I think it can be difficult to just say, oh, I can just pull out this one piece of it.
What is useful is if your dissertation is 175,000 words and no editor really wants more than 100,000 words, and you can lob off a whole piece of your dissertation into a journal article that's not going to be in the book at all, that's great.
Yeah, these are the practical tips.
Also, for those of you who may already be advising people, if you're allowing 175,000 word dissertations, I would like to speak to you privately on the deck. With that, I want to, again, just be attentive to time and really, really take this moment to thank, first and foremost, our attendees. Secondly, Maddie and Catherine for all of their work putting the event together. And then thirdly, absolutely, Margo and Niels and Kathleen for coming through for us, for being very patient about our long delay. And I very much hope we'll be able to do this again. I think it was absolutely, absolutely wonderful. Thanks, of course, to my co-host, Amelia. And with that, I just want to wish everybody the happiest of Fridays, that they make it through the winter, especially in Boston, and look forward to hopefully to seeing everyone in person or virtually again soon. Thanks also. Oh,
Thanks
go
so
ahead.
much for
Come
having us.
back at any
everyone.
time.
Yeah, thank you.
We like doing this.
Well, it really is magnificent. I think it's extremely helpful for everyone. And I just really appreciate how generous you've been with your time, but also the specificity of your responses. I think it's extremely helpful for our authors who, you know, people get conflicting advice. So to hear it from the three of you, I think is absolutely really, really useful. So thanks again. And with that, we'll sign off and we'll hope to see everyone soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Nice
Amelia.
to see all of you. Thank you so much. Take care.